Hi, folks. My name is Dr. Courtney Brunson. I am an associate dean at SEC, and today is our last Global Learning at Lunch for the 2023-2024 academic year. And I am joined by my friend, Chenxing Han, who is an author and a scholar of Buddhism, and her text that we'll be talking about today is Be the Refuge. And it's not assumed that folks have read the work, but instead we'll talk about some of the key topics that are in the text, and then hopefully that will inspire people to look at it or explore it. So Chenxing, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Courtney, and thanks everyone for joining us.
So as if you've joined our Global Learning at Lunches in the past, it's a pretty casual style. It's a conversation. And if people have questions, please ask them in the chat, and there will be time for that to do that as well. So Chenxing, can you start by giving a little bit about your background and your interest in pursuing studies in Buddhism?
Sure, yes. So I can, start kind of maybe in the very beginning. I was born in China and I came to the US when I was 4, so I primarily grew up in the US. My parents are not religious, which is pretty common for people of their generation who lived through the Chinese Cultural Revolution. But I really started to get interested in religion and spirituality kind of in high school, and especially during a gap year between high school and college. During that time, I was able to spend some time in Asia and travel a bit through China and Thailand and Nepal and Tibet. So I was being exposed to a lot of different forms of Buddhism and really wanting to learn more. And then got to dive more into that really in college in the Bay Area, since it's such a diverse part of the US. Though honestly, I would say there's Buddhism really kind of all over the US and sometimes in very surprising places. If people just take a quick look on Google, that's something I've been exploring more in recent years. But at any rate, when I started to visit both, read about Buddhism, usually, in English language sources, and think about Buddhism in America in particular, something I noticed was that a lot of the literature that was out there was really focused on white convert Buddhism, which is, of course, a really important strand of Buddhism in America. And then at the same time, I would go to Asian majority temples, Asian heritage Buddhist temples, for example, a Chinese temple or Vietnamese or Cambodian, Thai temples, etc., in the US. And I wouldn't see a lot of other young folks, right? A lot of other people who are teenagers or maybe in their 20s or 30s. And, granted, this was 15 or so years ago, but I think some of these trends still hold true. And so this started to get me thinking about young adults, particularly of Asian heritage. And in particular, I'd read this Pew Forum report in 2012 that noted that Buddhists are very much a minority in the US, only about 1%, but of those, 2/3 are of Asian heritage. And I just found that statistic to be so striking because in so much of both the popular and scholarly literature, people tend to, again, focus on the voices of white convert Buddhists. And so this just got me to think about things around race and culture and representation in American Buddhism. And I decided to embark on a series of interviews. And I was at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, where Professor Bunce also was. And that's how we met many years ago now. And that was just such a wonderful place to do this research project, really, around Asian American Buddhism, around identity, again, these issues of race and representation, as I mentioned. And so at this point, gosh, it's been like, I guess, almost 20 years of this exploration in Buddhism that I think just continues. And I would say maybe, I'm sure we'll get into this more, but doing this project, which took a long time to get published, about 9 years from first interview to publication. So it was this very long journey of listening, but one in which I really learned a great deal about the diversity of Buddhism in this country and just how much more there is to continue to learn and how many stories remain untold.
Thanks so much for just I know it's always hard to like compact your entire life into a few minutes, but that gives a really good sense of your context and your background and what brought you to this work. And so the work that we're talking about is Be the Refuge. And can you start off? So sometimes folks not familiar with Buddhist studies might accidentally read this as be the refugee. So can you talk about the word refuge in Buddhism?
Absolutely. And of course, I would add, refugees to the US also brought many forms of Buddhism post 1965 from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And so, yes, you're not the first person to point that out. So, this notion of refuge, there's an idea of taking refuge in Buddhism. This is kind of common to all different Buddhist traditions, taking refuge in the three gems. And those are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And so the Buddha being kind of the historical teacher of Buddhism and also just a figure of representing enlightenment, awakening, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings of Buddhism, and then the Sangha being the community of Buddhist practitioners. And so one can do chants or rituals in which one formally takes refuge. And this can happen in a multitude of different languages, Buddhist languages, whether Pali, a traditional Buddhist language of Theravada Buddhism, which is dominant in Thailand and Cambodia and Laos, or languages like Chinese and so forth. So taking refuge, I've been co-teaching this high school class, which I might talk about a little bit later. It's an immersive and experiential high school class called Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard. And one of our students was recently asking me like, oh, what does that mean? And I forget that maybe outside of Buddhist context, this notion of taking refuge might feel a little bit foreign or unfamiliar, but I guess one could think of it as kind of an act of entrustment or faith, or just wanting to find a place of safety, right? A place of ease, and putting one's, faith or entrustment or sense of ease in these three gems, again, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So I wanted to put that in the title. And there's also kind of a very specific story for how Be the Refuge as a title came about. But I don't know, Courtney, if you want me to get into that or if we'll talk about that a little bit later.
I would love to hear that because I've often wondered about that and thought about that of not only then you're taking refuge, but then you're also it's a call to action to be the refuge. So yes, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I would say that a lot of this book, at the heart of this book, and also my second book, which is a memoir about Buddhist chaplaincy or spiritual care, at the heart of both books is really this notion of spiritual friendship. And there's a quote from a Buddhist sutra called the Upada Sutra, in which the Buddha's cousin and attendant Ananda says to the Buddha, oh, spiritual friendship, holy friendship, that is half of the holy path, the spiritual friendship. And the Buddha says to Ananda, oh, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. Spiritual friendship is the whole of the holy path, of this Buddhist path. And it's just something I reflect a lot on and is really at the heart of this book. And I bring up this framing because this book wouldn't be possible without many, many people. But one person who I always have to mention is someone named Aaron Lee, who wrote a blog back in the 2010s or so, 2009, 2010 is when he started it, called The Angry Asian Buddhist. And the blog had a really catching title, right? A very startling title because people don't think about Buddhists as angry. And they also generally don't think about Asians or Asian Americans as angry. There are stereotypes that Asian Americans or Asians might not rock the boat, or, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. You hear these quotes, right? But the Angry Asian Buddhist was actually the first person I saw who was a young person of Asian descent, actually mixed race, Jewish and Chinese American. And at the time, none of us knew this. He was just blogging anonymously, but he was talking about, again, these issues of race and representation, talking about certain stereotypes he was seeing in the ways Buddhism was represented. For example, that Asian or Asian American Buddhists were superstitious or not real Buddhists because they weren't meditating like white convert Buddhists. And so obviously these kinds of stereotypes and tropes could be quite damaging, especially for young people. And Aaron really cared in particular about young people who might be getting messages like, oh, my grandma's Buddhism, that's not real. She's not a real Buddhist. I mean, what kinds of effects does that have on people's, psyches, on their spiritual and emotional lives? And so I was able to connect through, Dr. Scott Mitchell, who's now the Dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, I think maybe both of our advisors at the time. back when we were in graduate school. And he connected me with Aaron, who ended up just being an incredibly generous person in terms of supporting my research, helping me find people to interview. Um, and yeah, we actually became friends quite quickly. I visited him in LA. He would take me to Buddhist temples. And then he was diagnosed with cancer. And it was just so devastating and so sudden. He was only in his 30s, in fact. And in 2017, really tragically, he passed away from cancer. And right before he died, Aaron had done the Angry Asian Buddhist blog. He'd written some other things, and he actually started a new blog and he called it Be the Refuge. And he gave me permission to, if in the future I ever wanted to use his writing to share it with other people. And so there's a lot of Aaron's voice and stories, but that Be the Refuge blog post was so moving to me, and it's printed actually in full within the book. So this is a bit of a spoiler alert. If you don't want to know the reason behind the title, you should stop listening now. But during the time when he was going through these intensive rounds of chemo, he realized, gosh, it's actually really possible for each of us in every moment to be a refuge unto ourselves and for others. And so the nurse who would give him a smile, who would just take care of him, the people who were coming to clean his room, the people, all of his friends who were banding together to do bone marrow drives because they wanted to make it easier for other people, especially people of mixed race who so struggled to find bone marrow transplant matches to register themselves, something simple we can all do that can literally save a life. All of these people were finding ways to be a refuge for others. And he realized too, for himself, his own meditation practice or his own loving kindness meditation practice, all of these different practices, these different Buddhist teachings, applying them, he could also be a refuge for others who were visiting him in these sort of reciprocal relationships. And so you're right, absolutely, Courtney, that this book does have this kind of like invitation to action, invitation into spiritual friendship, invitation into this kind of seemingly simple, but not always easy practice of moment to moment. What does it look like for us to be a refuge for ourselves and for others?
And I love that too, of thinking about all these small ways adding up, because so often, especially in circles of Buddhist studies, there's discussions of like these supremely enlightened beings that kind of seem that goal seems somewhat unattainable. And so,
Right.
but when you pull together all these moments, that's really profound of thinking about
Mhm.
these small choices that people are making to help each other. All of that adds up to generosity and benevolence and loving kindness.
Absolutely. I love that you bring that up because, it makes me think of the Jataka tales, the past life stories of the Buddha. And when we read those, maybe in a past life he was an animal who offered a piece of fruit or something like that, something that simple. And it makes me think about being, a chaplain on an oncology unit actually, before Aaron died. So it was particularly poignant for me, that particular connection we had there. But yeah, patients who would maybe offer me an orange or vice versa, or just a kind word. And it's really, truly those small moments that really do add up to something quite extraordinary.
Yeah. And as a book title too, then thinking about then that the book itself is a living call. So that's continuing, the story of Arian is continuing on and reaching other lives,
Mhm.
which is also a really beautiful thing to think about. You talked about earlier, you were starting to talk about the images of Buddhism. And I think that's really important for folks at SEC for us to think about, because we do have communities of Buddhists in Lincoln, where we are in southeastern Nebraska, that seem like they're worlds apart. You have a Zen community that I would say is predominantly of white converts. And then we have Vietnamese communities that are pretty much functioning in Vietnamese. And so in some ways I've been trying to find ways to connect folks, right? And how do we talk to each other? And part of that is overcoming this two Buddhism paradigm. So can you talk a little bit about that, especially for people who may not be familiar with this paradigm?
Sure. So this notion of two Buddhisms kind of gets at a trope, if you will, or a schema that there are two Buddhisms in America, the Buddhism of white converts and the Buddhism of Asian immigrants. And I think like all schemas, there's some truth, some helpfulness, and then there's limitations, right? And so for this one in particular, it was kind of coined in the 60s and 70s, and actually not even so much along racial terms. At the time, the scholar Charles Prebish was thinking about two Buddhisms more in terms of thinking about how do these Buddhist communities, temples, or sanghas continue over time? What are some patterns we notice? And I think, if you take it kind of quite literally and it gets repeated in popular culture, and I think increasingly there's been sort of scholarly critical interventions trying to think about what are alternatives or what are ways we can nuance this a bit more. And I would say my book, Be the Refuge, is, part of a group, part of those efforts, I think, to nuance our understanding. So if you take white convert, first of all, you have plenty of people who are identify as white, Caucasian, and are the children of Buddhists. Are they really converts, or they're more like second generation Buddhists in their family, right? Or even third generation. So that's a little tricky. And then this sort of white Asian binary, well, obviously that is leaving out Black and Latine and Native American and mixed race and all of these other groups. And so that's also a bit reductionist. And then also on the Asian immigrant side, the oldest form continuously running temples in the US are part of the Buddhist Churches of America, which is a Japanese American it's called Jodo Shinshu is the name of the sect, or Shin Buddhism, and began predominantly with Japanese immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century. So these are like fifth or sixth generation Buddhists who may not necessarily identify so much as immigrants anymore in the same way that we tend to think of recent immigrants. And so with the typology, if you will, the schema or typology tends to kind of flatten these sorts of differences in generation and all kinds of all kinds of complex and nuanced possibilities within that. And I think for me, as I read more about it, what was particularly disturbing to me is when the typology would shade into kind of what felt like quite Orientalist or racist tropes. So like, oh, the white converts, they only meditate and they're very scientific and they're very rational. And then it kind of implies, oh, the Asian converts, they're just like bowing and like chanting and like, that's not really real Buddhism. And first of all, there's plenty of white converts who bow and chant and engage in ritual and vice versa. But more to the point, to cast these kinds of value judgments and to paint this story of American Buddhism really felt to me really incomplete. It would be like taking a couple strands and pretending it's the whole tapestry, when in fact the whole tapestry is made up of so many more strands.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's this anytime a group is kind of defending their own tradition and then has that power. So I'm thinking about too of that othering that you're speaking to. So if one group is able to really think of themselves as, okay, I found the true Buddhism, and that's what we see in the history of Buddhism in America, especially with language translations of the Buddhist Catechism going back 100 years ago, then there's a positioning of the other and the power that's part of that. So can you speak a little bit to because so much of when I was reading your book, I was thinking about, because you say you're raising the voices of Asian American. And I was thinking, wow, like you're creating the space for young people to talk about their complicated religious and spiritual identities. So can you speak a little bit to how you went about interviewing folks? I know you found a lot of folks. I know Aaron connected you, sound like Aaron connected you to a lot of people. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. If I came up with all of these interview questions. At the time, I really hadn't seen anything that involved talking to Asian American Buddhists across a wide spectrum of ethnicities and across a wide spectrum of Buddhist traditions. There was really excellent work in the sociology of religion that would tend to focus on a particular ethnic group, say a Korean Buddhist temple or a Taiwanese Buddhist temple, and all of that was very valuable. But because those works were really like cited ethnographies at a particular religious site, they tended not to include young people because young people weren't going to temples. And, I don't think that's unique to Buddhist temples. I think a lot of religious institutions are grappling with how do we connect with young people today. And so I decided I would try to do one-on-one interviews. And I had all of these questions because I was thinking, oh, no one's really going to talk to me. So I might as well like bombard them with as much information as possible. Questions about, their personal identities. What what was their relationship to this term Asian or Asian American? What was their relationship to Buddhism? Even to young adult, right? These are all kind of like all our categories, a bit nebulous, like they're always changing throughout time. And so I didn't say, oh, you have to be an American citizen, you have to, be this, but rather I just said, if you're full or partial heritage from anywhere in Asia, and I mean South Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, like, very broadly, you are welcome to do this study. And you don't have to be a card carrying or robe wearing Buddhist, if you will. Like, just if you have an interest in Buddhism and you're wanting to talk with me and go through this whole interview, please talk to me. And I was like, yeah, if you're a young adult, just 18 plus for the sake of my, IRB approval. But I've got a few 40-year-olds who felt they were young at heart. I was like, sure, so I wasn't very strict about these parameters, in part because at the time, this term Asian American Buddhist wasn't being used by a lot of people. We'd heard Asian American Christian, but really like Asian American Buddhist, I think one of my most common responses was, do I count? Like I'm South Asian, but sometimes Asian American seems to only mean East Asian. Do I count? Or, well, I don't know if I go around saying I'm Buddhist. And I would say like, I'm really interested in the reasons why you don't go around saying you're Buddhist, right? And so part of my method was kind of being open with these categories and inviting people to kind of play with these categories with me, think about what are the limits of these categories and their possibilities. And then in terms of actually reaching out to people, it's exactly like you said. Aaron helped me by putting a call out. I would went I knew people and they would recommend other people. I asked each interviewee to recommend others, going to different Buddhist temples and just kind of a snowball sampling. So I wasn't trying to be representative. That would have been, I think, impossible actually, because there's no national database of Buddhists. And it's not like I could have chosen a statistically representative sample. So what I wanted to do instead was really to try to find a range of diversity, which I think was achieved while recognizing here's groups or people that are missing. And also each individual person's spiritual life is so complex and messy. We know this ourselves, right? We're constantly changing over time. And so to give some room for just surprises, I think, letting people answer more open-ended questions like tell me about your spiritual journey, and doing follow-up questions. And so much to my surprise, I ended up getting 26 in-person interviews, and the interviews were 1.5 to 4.5 hours long, 5.5 hours long, actually. People had so much to say. And so I realized I'd struck a nerve. And what a lot of folks said was, I just never had a chance to reflect on both my race and ethnicity and my religion as an Asian American, as a Buddhist. This was really my first time. And I also, even as part of the interview, I had this interactive activity where I printed out a bunch of different like practices, Buddhist practices on cards and let people sort them and rank them. And what I found there was people were just engaging in a lot of different practices, including meditation, but also bowing or chanting, or there were practices they hadn't done but wanted to try, like pilgrimage or things like that. And so that was just a really fun activity because I couldn't go with them to the temples. It was my way of trying to like spark conversation, because sometimes, like we want something tangible to feel or play with, and that can really spark more conversations. And then, to that point, I also asked people about representations of Buddhism in America. And so I would give them examples, for example, a blog post from the Angry Asian Buddhist, and I just have people respond to that, or different statistics about the decline of Asian American Buddhists, or a quote that seemed to suggest American Buddhist is only the Buddhism of white converts. And so people in the interviews had something to respond to. And there were all of these different sections. And what I ended up with was these 26 in-person interviews. And then so many more people wanted to be interviewed that I actually adapted my interviews to an email format and ended up doing these email interviews and often following up. And to this day, some of the people who, someone who like reached out to me, just cold call, like, I heard about your project online, I want to participate and learn more. If like they're some of them are very close friends to this day.
Wow, I love that approach, especially the idea of giving people something to respond to, and because that will strike an emotion, so strike a response in some way. If anybody is joining us or has joined us part way through, I am talking to Chenxing Han, who's the author of Be the Refuge, and talking about really thinking about what does it mean to be Buddhist. And I love, you're talking about, do I count? And that was something that I kept like underlining in your text of questions from practitioners regarding what qualifies as Buddhist, based on how much they practice or how devoted they are, and these challenges with labeling oneself as Buddhist. And so I wondered, especially for those whom, we talked about the two Buddhism trope, which doesn't at all help because people are messy, like you talked about, everybody is very messy. But can you talk a little bit about some of those practices that aren't always openly discussed by second gen Asian Buddhists? These practices that they're really prevalent. I mean, you think about traveling through Asia, and these are the practices that you see, but yet in the US, sometimes they're hidden, and and so then it's almost like they're closeted in some ways. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Sure. I think this has a lot to do with the kind of extreme dominance of mindfulness and the ways that either mindfulness gets completely secularized and people don't even think about Buddhist roots, or people just kind of equate mindfulness with Buddhism. And by mindfulness, really like a very particular form of seated meditation. And so it's sort of, there's some idea that like seated meditation is the end all and be all to Buddhist practice. And, this is like, there's lots of great books out there thinking about the histories of lay people instead of monastics doing seated meditation, great movements that have come out of Burma, spread throughout Thailand, other parts of Southeast Asia. So I won't go into all of that, but suffice to say that pretty much the vast majority of Buddhists in Asia, and including in the US, are not just meditating all the time and saying, okay, this is my Buddhist credentials, are evident on this, what I would call the Buddhist, the meditation resume check is what I used to laughingly call it when people would say, like, how many retreats have you sat? How many hours, And, we touched on so many of these practices earlier, and it came out through the card sorting activities. Service, acts of service, generosity, maybe that looks like chopping vegetables because your temple feeds, 200 or 300 people a free vegetarian lunch every Sunday, right? As is the case for many Vietnamese Buddhist temples in the Bay Area where we were. That itself as a Buddhist practice, certainly chanting, bowing, rituals, incense lighting. I mean, these ceremonies are kind of the lifeblood of Buddhism. And indeed, I think some of the meditation communities I've encountered have actually started to recognize how important this is when, they need to hold a service, for example, for someone who's passed. And maybe it's a little strange if you just decide to stare at a wall for 50 minutes in silence during a funeral. Like, people are wanting to engage, right? This is a way of community building when we can participate together in chanting and bowing, when we can use our, whole bodies. And of course, arguably meditation is also a kind of ritual. And by no means am I trying to denigrate it, but it's quite problematic if we say that's the only way to be a real Buddhist. And suddenly we're saying, oh, those aunties shucking peas, that's not a real Buddhist. It's like, well, actually the center wouldn't be running without the aunties shucking peas. And like, to be fair too, I think you'll hear some of these tropes in both Asian cultures and non-Asian cultures. So in other words, the emphasis on the modern, the rational, there's always this desire to maybe cover up, for example, other practices that might be seen as more shamanic, or, whether people are like lighting a joss stick or speaking with ancestors. Or Buddhism throughout time has always kind of melded into the cultures it's been a part of. It's not always so easy to decide what is purely Buddhist and what is a different cultural influence. What does it look like to honor one's ancestors if people are offering, food or water or rice or things for their deceased grandparents or for other ancestors and elders? That to some people may be part of their Buddhist and cultural and, broader ancestral practices, and these can all be quite interconnected. And so I think something that's really powerful for studying Buddhism, I think, is that it does go against often ideas of like purity or like very strict boundaries, that in fact, as it's a core tenet in Buddhism, everything is always changing. And so part of the challenge is like studying the changes. And it's usually a pretty good sign if we want to say Buddhism is X, that actually we're going to be, we're going to be off. We're going to be just looking at one small piece of the bigger puzzle, or, just following one thread of this very broad and vibrant tapestry.
Mhm. When I was reading through some of the interviews, I have a student who, she was my student when I taught at the University of Nebraska over 10 years ago. And I've been taking students to the Vietnamese temple for that length of time. And what's interesting to me is that, so I've seen how she explains the temple and how she, explains what it means to her to be Buddhist. And it's been interesting to me to hear her explanations change over the time, the more that her academic study of Buddhism has changed. And so it's just, so talking about like fluidity, and also like fluidity, not just of practice, but then also fluidity of like how people explain themselves and who the audience is. And so I was just thinking about the more that people are aware of the complexity, and what I've seen in this case of my student, my friend, is that the more that she's almost like become aware of how her own tradition fits into other traditions, and she's explaining her tradition in different ways too. And so I wondered if you encountered that at all also with your interviewers, of like in their process of explaining themselves, that maybe even how they thought of themselves as Buddhists also changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was sort of happening. I felt a little bit like, you know, though Dr. Payne, the former dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, would not like me using the word theology. In a way, we were kind of doing a kind of theology together, or Buddhology, but thinking about applying Buddhist teachings and practices to our lives and trying to make sense of it. And so much of that kind of making sense happens in community or in dialogue with other people. And so I think that's why some of these interviews ended up being so long. I didn't ask people to have like the final polished answer. It's just like, let's think about this together, because these questions have been tormenting me for a while. And I just want a bigger community of like thought partners and people to be in dialogue about this with.
I think this would be a good time to share some context. So some of the practices that Chenxing was talking about is they take place in Vietnamese temples and you're right. I mean, even the ceremonies that happen at this, I've noticed the Zen Center here even has more ceremonies that's been added to it. And so people are kind of like, they're drawn to ceremonies. And so a colleague of ours, a friend of ours, Pierce Salguero, put together a project called the Jivaka Project, named after the Buddha's doctor, because Pierce predominantly does healing practices in Buddhist studies. But we thought it'd be helpful to show, it's a very short ceremony, and then we can talk through it. And again, if folks have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Let me know if sound doesn't work. But this is showing an annual Medicine Buddha ceremony at a Vietnamese temple in Philadelphia. And while I don't have a documentary from the Linh Quang temple that's local, it's a ceremony that is similar to what would take place here.
Đều có sức thần thông và có trí tuệ sáng suốt, trên thẳng tâm Phật dưới đồng muôn loài. Every year in the New Year, that's the tradition from the Buddha. We will pray for everybody around the world, have the good luck, good health, always live in good life. If you are the sickness, you get recover, you get out from the sickness, and you are staying healthy. Pray for everybody have a good, healthy, good luck. Live in peace together, live in wealthy together, and always you are not achieved by the sickness, by the die, by the everything harmful for you. That we pray for you. Back to you. vậy của cải sung túc cho đến chứng tượng đạo quả vô thượng bồ đề nguyện thứ ta nguyện đời sau khi chứng tượng đạo bồ đề nếu có điểm phụ nữ nào bị trong A Di Đà Phật.
Rồi sư, quá đẹp.
Rồi, quá đẹp ha. Rồi thôi mình vỗ tay qua cô. Rồi Phật tử đi xuống cúng của quyền sách tổ đó là mình xuống dùng cơm, ai xuống dùng cơm thì dùng cơm, mình ra phía sau cúng cơm của quyền nữa ha. Cúng dòng ở bên này ra phía sau.
We thought that might be a good way to show everything that, Chenxing, what you're talking about, cutting up the vegetables, the offerings, the incense burning, the rituals, the chanting, the bowing, and thinking about articulating this, practice, if folks don't have this kind of practice as a form of reference, you talked about how the mindfulness movement, then it doesn't help to explain, if someone's practicing mindfulness and thinking of that as Buddhism, and it's difficult to articulate ceremonies if that's your reference language. And so I was wondering if you could talk through more of what you're hearing from your interviewees about their own challenges for explaining these practices that are complicated, and they're cultural, they have so much of rooting within family and ceremonies. What did you hear as some of these barriers for explaining, Buddhist practice?
Yeah, I guess I'm reminded of a Cambodian American interviewee who'd grown up Buddhist because it's so much a part of Cambodian culture, and I think she was told to do mindfulness as part of like a summer camp activity. So in a fairly secular way, she came to encounter it, and she was just thought, wow, this is just really different than what I grew up with. There was kind of this gap between thinking about, making offerings to monastics, or even having a kind of like party, or having a place where it was a space of refuge for especially her parents and her grandparents. And I think something that would come up in a lot of the interviewees is talking about gaps in language, where, if one didn't grow up, let's say, we look at this video, you can see some of the little kids. I love the scene where the kids like fidgeting a little bit. Even in the best of circumstances, one might not understand the Vietnamese, and then especially the Buddhist Vietnamese, which is kind of based on Chinese. And so there's a lot of degrees in which second generation immigrants in particular might not actually understand what's happening at the Buddhist temples of their parents, of their grandparents. And yet at the same time, when they tried to access Buddhism in English, they were suddenly met with sometimes a wall of white faces, or just only mindfulness. And so they were trying to figure out, okay, where do I fit in all of this? Or like you were saying earlier, what are the ways we can bridge? Because sometimes it really does feel like there's two Buddhisms. But I think actually a lot of times, if we attend to this dimension of language in particular, what's the primary language of different temples? And some temples are quite bilingual or multilingual, and you see actually quite a diverse group of people who are going there. And some temples are more, very much English focused, or some, are just in Tibetan, or just in Laotian, or, primarily that. But these temples, like the people, are also constantly changing from generation to generation. I think when we look at the case of Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, it's so interesting to see how it's changed over the generations, and how, the Institute of Buddhist Studies was where we went, was the first Buddhist seminary in the nation that had to be established in the late 1940s to start training English-speaking ministers in America, not just Japan. And so, I mean, these are some of the themes that came up. And then, also you speak of challenges. Some people just spoke very frankly about how they didn't want to come out as Buddhist in their particular settings, because students would bully them, or sometimes even teachers would bully them, depending on what kinds of, where they were living, what the dominant religion is. And, still in many ways, we live in a white Christian dominant nation, or, some might even say supremacist in that sense. And I think there's competing visions of, is the US a multiracial and multi-religious place, or is it actually really a place that's really meant primarily to, a white Protestant nation, for example. And so I think we can start to think through some of these debates through the lenses of different people. But yeah, I think listening carefully, and especially listening carefully for the voices less heard, I think is an important way for us to start to get a more nuanced understanding.
I agree. Yeah. And that actually leads us well to one of our instructors, Kimberly, put a question in the chat, and actually it leads to this sense of like who dominates what is religious and who dominates the language of religion. And in academic studies, we've gone so much more. In Buddhist studies, we've had to really push to have studies from the ground up to avoid this Buddhism is this and like top down, but instead just let Buddhism be the messiness that people are, that they practice. And so this leads us really, really well to Kimberly's question about a friend who says that Buddhism is a philosophy rather than a religion. And that has been part of that like two Buddhisms trope, right? Of like philosophy coming more so from like a white convert perspective, and then what? I mean, like it's just kind of like, what does that mean? So can you speak to that point a little bit of your thoughts on that, and kind of even thinking about the implications of that question and everything that's surrounding that?
Yeah, thank you so much for this really thoughtful question, Kimberly. I think I'll speak to like an anecdote, and then I'll speak very directly to your question. But Courtney, I really appreciate how you said you've been taking students to the Vietnamese temple. And this reminds me of this high school class that I'm co-teaching. So I'll just share a little bit about it. It actually came about from Be the Refuge, this book, when a high school teacher at Phillips Academy, Andover, in Andover, Massachusetts, a boarding school in Massachusetts, he'd been an instructor there named Andy Huzio reached out to me after reading Be the Refuge. And he said, I've been teaching Buddhism, Asian religions, and philosophy for more than a dozen years. And I read Be the Refuge, and I want to teach it differently. I don't want to just teach this as like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and these like abstract theories. He's like, what do you think? Well, first he said, what do you think about talking to my 10th graders? And I said, oh, I thought this book would be better for like college students, but I'd be happy to speak to your 10th graders. They were exceedingly thoughtful. And then he followed up by saying, I was thinking of doing this immersive class just on Buddhism. And what was really extraordinary is he and some other teachers had advocated for this kind of term-long, 10-week-long for high school seniors. So during their spring term, they could drop all of their usual 5 or 6 classes and focus on one interdisciplinary project. And in our case, we developed a project around Buddhism. And originally, Andy wanted to do Buddhism in Boston. And I did a quick Google search and I said, wow, there's a dozen Buddhist temples right here in the Merrimack Valley within like a 25-minute drive of your school. We don't have to drive the 40 plus minutes to Boston. And so what's come out of that is this very different pedagogy for thinking about Buddhism. The first year we did 8 intensive days of temple visits. I've never visited that many temples for that long, like even in Asia, it felt that way, and it was extraordinary because we didn't have to be limited by 50 minutes in a classroom just reading texts. We were, like we saw in the video, fully immersed. We were bowing together. We were lighting incense. We were offering food to the monks. We were asking questions to the incredibly generous people who hosted us, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours at a time. We were so excited by everything we were learning. We would go to a cafe afterwards and, talk for another 2 hours. And then we would realize this cafe is called Nibbana Cafe, and it's run by a Cambodian American who goes to another local temple. And then suddenly we would have another connection to this local temple. And so I say all of this because, it really speaks to like what we encounter first is often how we're going to think of something, right? It's going to be limited. And so for our students, I think they would be similarly confused now that they've spent all of this time at different temples. They've seen their majority Asian temples. There's, Cambodian, Thai, Lao, Chinese. They've gone to rituals there. They've talked to people there. And they've seen people also learning, they've heard about Buddhist philosophy, but they understand that that is part of a much bigger picture, right? Part of this lived religion, like it's really alive. And so I think that, yes, there are lots of people who say Buddhism is a philosophy rather than a religion. And I would add, like, including people who are of Asian heritage who prefer to relate that way. And I would say that that is actually one orientation that people choose to have towards Buddhism. And, it might be interesting just to talk to them about, oh, can you tell me, how do you define philosophy? And, what is your definition of religion? And certainly if one's definition of religion is that a single creator God created everything, and well, Buddhism really doesn't have that. So if one takes a rather, Christian-centric definition of religion, then maybe I would be inclined to agree. But I myself would say that Buddhism is most certainly a religion as we understand it, but just in the ways that it structures people's lives with ethics, with different values, with, there's so much there. It is not, quote unquote, merely a philosophy. So I think there's lots of implications, and I hope that starts to answer your question. But the one dimension that I'm really interested in is this pedagogical dimension, as well as this sort of practical dimension. So pedagogically, how do we teach Buddhism, and what gets left out when we're not doing this in ways that are relational and embodied? Because our students they're not graded for this course. So they're super motivated now because they've made connections at these temples. They've experienced such intense generosity, enormous generosity. They find their own values challenged. Their own belief systems are certainly thrown off because they don't know much about Buddhism, and now they're encountering it from all of these different perspectives. They're like living the messiness of lived religions, right? And then pedagogically, and then I would say practically, pragmatically speaking too, if we keep insisting Buddhism as a philosophy, what does that mean for people who are living it as a religion, right? As what does that mean for us as just citizens? And so I think these are all really important questions that we can be asking. And thank you again, Kimberly, for that a very generative question.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the more that you get folks like inside of practice and inside communities, then they realize that those any labels or any ways that we're trying to that confine practices, they don't work. They just don't, they can't. And so when you're talking about, having this immersive experience, I've been thinking a lot about teaching religion in terms of how we teach language. And so I have a 5-year-old who I take to a Mandarin, since I speak Mandarin, I take her to a Mandarin Chinese class. And when you learn Mandarin as a college student, you're learning it from, here are the tones, here's the grammar structure, this very top down. But it's interesting because for her, she's learning the tones naturally. She doesn't know that there's 4 tones in Chinese, but she doesn't need to know that there's 4 tones in Chinese because she's just learning the tones.
Exactly.
And so I was thinking about that when you're talking about when you get immersed in these communities and these practices, you really no longer try to identify always what is philosophy, what is religion, because it's all just interconnected and lived out and practiced just like language.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's like the perfect metaphor. I'm so happy that you raised that. I was thinking as we went to these temples, at one of the Thai temples, we saw a little girl, and her dad was white, her mom was Thai, but her mom wasn't there that day. So it was just her dad taking her, and her grandma was there too. So they're both Caucasian, and she was mixed race. And then she must have been like 2 or 3. And she went and she was just saying, I'm going to go to temple today. And so she bowed to the monk, and then with a little bit of, parental help. And then she had all these little coins, and she was putting them in the donation box where we might usually put bills. And I was just thinking oh yeah, we're also these 17 and 18-year-old students. We're also kind of like baby Buddhists, but here's her organically learning about, the foundations of Buddhism, like dana, or the word for generosity, and paying respect to the monastics and things like that. And we're here being oh no, okay, I'm coaching the students, no, don't point your feet at the Buddha, don't point your feet at the monks, And so I totally agree with you that we can definitely lose something when we're trying to be so theoretical, trying to get it all right, or put it within these parameters, that there's other ways of learning. And I think that's what's been most powerful for our students. It's actually very uncomfortable to, get at these other ways of learning. And I think sometimes with people who insist Buddhism as a philosophy, often, it veils a kind of discomfort with religion. And I think that's just really interesting if they're willing to open up about that, to ask them what is that about for you? And can you share more, without judgment, but just really with the sense of curiosity and wondering.
Right. Why do you want Buddhism to be a philosophy? What about your own background?
Right.
Has led you to that? Another one of our instructors, Griff, he asks about Buddhists facing canonical crossroads, with the example of Catholics and pro-choice. And Griff, was there more that you wanted to say, or is that because I see, or does that capture your question?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I just was wondering if you do face these sort of crossroads, but I mean, I'm going back and forth. But both of you are explaining this so well. Buddhism as a religion, Buddhism as philosophy, and I make my mind up, and then you change my mind, and then I make my mind up, and you change it back because you're explaining everything so fluidly. And I suppose maybe the premise of all the questions I've asked you is kind of wrong. Why am I insisting that it has to be one box or the other box? And so I was kind of typing another question: is can it be amalgamated or incorporated as philosophy, religion, and yet also be something else? I mean, can you live a Buddhist kind of life and yet also consider yourself Jewish, for example? Is that, I mean, everything is individually defined, and I understand that, but also I was thinking canologically, is that accepted, let's say, at a temple or other sort of place of worship? But you're doing such a terrific job of explaining things. My questions are wildly inarticulate.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is certainly yes. I mean, Aaron himself, who I mentioned, was Jewish and also Buddhist. And I think that, there are people who are Christian and also really resonate with Buddhist teachings. And of course, this might differ. There's so many different Buddhist traditions, as diverse as the Christian tradition is, to just take one example, the Buddhist tradition is as well. So I think you're right that it does have this reputation, Buddhism does, for being inclusive and welcoming. And I think it's also very helpful to remember that Buddhism has been used for violence or to justify war in the Japanese case, or even, violence against Muslims in the case of Burma and Thailand, unfortunately, but obviously there's groups of people who are somehow theologically justifying that for themselves. But in terms of Buddhism and other religions, there's you may be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, the now late Vietnamese Buddhist Chan master, who's probably as famous as His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So his works are very influential. So even if the name might not be immediately familiar, if you go to any bookstore pretty much and go to the Buddhism section, there's bound to be a vast array of books by this Vietnamese Zen master who was nominated by Martin Luther King Jr. for a Nobel Peace Prize. There's some really powerful anti-war activism that he was part of, a very powerful image of Dr. King and Thich Nhat Hanh together. And he's been extremely influential, but he has a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ. And so that's speaking very directly to some of these issues, I think. And again, I would say like throughout history, Buddhism has really blended, or it's been fluid, like Courtney has said, like within a Tibetan context, for example, being merging with Bön, the indigenous shamanic religions, or with China, you see a blend of Buddhism and Taoism and folk religion, and we impose these categories, right? But as it was lived, I think that there was often like a back and forth. It's not to say there wasn't tension, or, I think like Buddhism can be used in ways that wield power or in a kind of supremacist sort of way. So I by no means want to sugarcoat that, but I do think that maybe different from the Catholic Church, there's not this like very central singular figure, right? People will sometimes think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but he's really a spiritual leader, not a political leader, and for this Tibetan diaspora, and he's certainly held that way, but he doesn't hold that sway over all of the Buddhists in the world. And so I would say that's quite different than the Catholic Church. And yeah, so it's very interesting to do some of these interfaith comparisons, and again, to remember that Buddhism, as we get it through media representations, is often oversimplified in the American context. And at the same time, some of our assumptions or our frameworks, if we really just begin with Christian, assumptions, there will be a lot that we're going to get confused about. And so some of what's nice about taking students to the Buddhist temple, and they're kind of like, these students are young, so they're a bit more of a blank slate. They sort of have impressions of Buddhism, but when they start there, then suddenly they're starting with a new set of assumptions. They're actually like not coming in feeling like, I need to compare the Buddhism I see with this checklist that I read about to make sure, like, is this real or is this not real? But the part of it is actually around being really aware of like, yeah, what are our frameworks and assumptions? And like, oh, are they working in this case? Or actually, if I talk to these people and just spend more time with them, wow, actually, this is not their operating framework, right? Like, for example, I might be thinking of like sin or punishment, but they're actually thinking about karma, for example, or rebirth. And that is a really very different way of engaging with the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I think also to your question that you've typed about canonical crossroads, like certainly, Buddhist debates, Buddhist theology, if you will, is constantly happening, now and in the past, and will continue to in the future. Debates continue for monastics, for lay people. There's certainly, Buddhists who are pro-choice and on the opposite side of the political spectrum. And so like you really see kind of a wide range as you would for any other major world religion.
Well, Chenxing, we are getting at our time, and I just want to thank you so much for spending this hour with us, and for everyone who is on the live call or watching the video to grab Be the Refuge. And then you also have a second book,
Yeah,
right?
it's called One Long Listening. One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care. Yes.
Well, and all these questions that we're ending on of just really kind of the complicated nature of what it means to be Buddhist, what it means to be Asian American, second generation, young adult. This is those stories are really so well done and beautiful in Chenxing's work. And so I just encourage everyone to grab it. And if there's further questions that folks have, if there's any topics that arose for you out of today's conversations, let us know, and we can continue it. But Chenxing, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. Such a joy to be in conversation with all of you. And thank you all for your really thoughtful questions, making time to join us today.